Picture this. You wake up 30,000 years ago, and the first thing that hits you isn't the stunning sunrise over an untouched landscape. No, it's the smell. That lovely cocktail of unwashed bodies, rotting meat from last week's mammoth kill, and whatever your cave mate decided to do in the corner, because nobody's invented the concept of a designated bathroom yet. Welcome to the Stone Age, where every single day is a complex algorithm of survival, and one wrong move in your mental code means you're saber-toothed tiger food. Before we dive into why your ancestors were basically running biological computers that would make Silicon Valley jealous, hit that like button if you're glad you live in an era with indoor plumbing. And seriously, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because I'm curious how many of you are sitting in climate-controlled rooms right now, completely oblivious to the computational miracle that got you here. Now grab something to eat, preferably something that won't give you parasites, dim those lights, and let's explore how Groke and his buddies were debugging reality itself without even knowing what a bug was. You see, we like to think programming started with punch cards and vacuum tubes, but that's adorable, really. Programming started the moment one of your hairy ancestors looked at a sharp rock and thought, if rock plus stick equals spear, then spear plus mammoth equals dinner. That's an if-then statement, right there. Executed flawlessly without a single line of written code. Your prehistoric brain is sitting there in its skull cave, running thousands of parallel processes, track the wind direction, calculate the sun's position, remember which berries killed Og last summer, store the facial patterns of 30 tribe members, map every water source within a day's walk, process the subtle body language that means your rival is about to challenge you for leadership. And here's the kicker. You're doing all of this while your hardware is running on about 2,000 calories a day, most of which you haven't even found yet. Modern programmers complain when their laptop battery dies after 8 hours. Your ancestors were running their biological operating systems on whatever grubs they managed to dig up that morning, and they still had enough processing power left over to invent fire, create art, and develop complex social hierarchies. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical morning looked like for these natural programmers. You wake up, and immediately your brain starts running its morning diagnostic, threat assessment subroutine, scanning, no immediate predators detected, resource evaluation protocol, engaged, estimated food reserves, critical social dynamics calculator, processing, that weird tension from last night's argument over who gets the warm spot by the fire is still affecting group cohesion metrics. Weather prediction algorithm suggests rain within 2 hours based on cloud formations, wind patterns, and that ache in your left knee. That's never wrong. Time to execute morning routine batch file. First, check the trap lines you set yesterday. This requires loading your mental map of the area, calculating the most efficient route that avoids the territory of that aggressive bear you spotted 3 days ago, while also factoring in the energy expenditure versus potential caloric gain. Your brain is literally running a traveling salesman problem solution, except if you get it wrong, you don't just waste gas, you become something else's breakfast. And speaking of breakfast, finding food isn't just about knowing where the good berries grow, it's about running a complex pattern recognition system that would make modern AI jealous. Is that mushroom the one that tastes like chicken, or the one that makes you see your dead grandmother and then actually join her? Your ancestors developed mental databases of thousands of plants, animals, tracks, sounds, and smells. They could tell you what animal passed through, how long ago, which direction it went, whether it was injured, and probably what it had for lunch, all from a few bent blades of grass. This wasn't some mystical ancient wisdom either. This was pure computational power. Every successful hunt was preceded by what we'd now call predictive modeling. You're tracking a herd of deer, but you're not just following them, you're running simulations. If the herd goes left at the river, they'll hit the rocky outcrop and have to turn north. If they go right, they'll end up in that valley where the wind swirls and carries scent in unpredictable patterns. You're calculating wind speed, herd dynamics, individual animal behavior patterns you've observed over years, terrain difficulty, and the stamina levels of your hunting party. All of this while your stomach is growling loud enough to potentially alert your prey. Modern video game AI wishes it could match the complexity of what your brain was doing naturally. But here's where it gets really interesting. These weren't solo operations. Prehistoric humans were running distributed computing networks before anyone knew what those words meant. A hunting party wasn't just a group of people with pointy sticks. It was a coordinated system where each member was processing different data streams and sharing information through a sophisticated communication protocol. Hand signals, bird calls, even the way you walked could convey complex information to your teammates. You step on a twig, that's not just a mistake, it's a data packet sent to every predator within 100 meters announcing your location, direction of travel, approximate weight, and level of caution. Your ancestors learned to minimize these accidental broadcasts while simultaneously reading everyone else's. That rustle in the bushes could be wind, could be prey, could be another predator, or could be Bob from the neighboring tribe trying to sneak up on your camp. Your pattern recognition software needs to analyze amplitude, frequency, rhythm, and direction, cross-reference it with environmental factors like wind speed and recent rainfall that affects how leaves sound when disturbed, and deliver a threat assessment in under 2 seconds. Take too long, and you're dead. React too quickly, and you've just thrown your spear at a bush while the real threat circles behind you. And let's talk about memory management for a second. You don't have Google, you don't have books, you don't even have writing. Everything, and I mean everything, has to be stored in your wet, squishy hard drive. The location of every seasonal food source, the migration patterns of dozens of animal species, which plants cure stomach aches and which ones cause them, the intricate social dynamics of your 30-person tribe, including who owes whom favors and who's secretly sleeping with whom, the stories and myths that encode crucial survival information, the crafting techniques for dozens of tools, the weather patterns that predict seasonal changes, and the detailed mental maps of territories covering hundreds of square miles. Your hippocampus is basically running a geographic information system that would cost millions to develop today. But memory wasn't just storage, it was active processing. You had to constantly update and optimize your data. That creek that was here last spring, it's moved. The bear den that was empty last winter, occupied now with cubs, which means Mama Bear is extra aggressive and has expanded her territory. The flint deposit you've been using for 20 years, almost exhausted. Time to find a new source. Your brain was continuously rewriting its database, pruning outdated information, strengthening important pathways, and creating new connections. This is machine learning, except the machine is made of meat, and the training data could literally eat you if you get it wrong. Every night around the fire, when the elders told stories, they weren't just entertaining, they were uploading software patches to the younger generation. That story about the hunter who ignored the signs and walked into a saber-toothed den, that's a warning encoded in narrative, a way to transmit crucial pattern recognition protocols without having to let everyone learn from potentially fatal first-hand experience. The stories were version control for survival software, ensuring that critical knowledge didn't die with individuals. And the really mind-blowing part, they were doing all of this while simultaneously developing language itself. Imagine trying to debug code while you're still inventing the programming language. That's basically what your ancestors were doing every single day. They were creating words for concepts that didn't have words yet, developing grammar structures that could convey complex conditional statements, and building a shared verbal operating system that allowed for increasingly sophisticated information transfer between biological processes. Comment below if you've ever tried to explain something technical to someone who doesn't speak your language, because that's basically what every conversation was like when language was still in beta. The social dynamics alone required incredible computational power. You're living in a group where everyone knows everyone, where every action has social consequences, and where maintaining your reputation literally affects your survival chances. If people don't trust you, they won't share food when you're hungry. If they don't respect you, they won't follow your lead when you spot danger. You're constantly running facial recognition, emotional state analysis, relationship mapping, and behavioral prediction on everyone around you. That person who's been acting weird lately, your brain is running diagnostic algorithms. Are they sick? Are they planning something? Are they upset about something? Did they see you take that extra piece of meat when you thought no one was looking? Modern social media algorithms trying to predict human behavior are primitive compared to what your ancestors' brains were doing in real time. They could read micro-expressions that lasted milliseconds, detect changes in body odor that indicated emotional states, and pick up on subtle shifts in group dynamics that predicted conflicts days before they erupted. This wasn't intuition, it was high-speed data processing of thousands of social variables, and the multitasking was insane. While you're napping a flint tool, a process that requires precise motor control and the ability to visualize the final product while working with an unpredictable material, you're also listening for danger, monitoring the social dynamics of your group, keeping track of the sun's position to estimate remaining daylight, planning your next move based on weather conditions, and probably keeping half an eye on your kids to make sure they're not eating poison berries or poking sleeping predators with sticks. Your prefrontal cortex is juggling more balls than a quantum computer calculating parallel universes. Every tool they made was essentially hardware engineering. You want to make a spear. First you need to model the physics. What's the optimal weight distribution? Too heavy in the front and you can't throw it far. Too light and it won't penetrate. The shaft needs to be strong enough to not break on impact but flexible enough to not shatter. The binding that holds the point needs to withstand repeated stress without loosening. You're solving engineering problems that modern students learn in university, except you're doing it through trial and error with no safety equipment and where product failure means starving. The knowledge transfer between generations was basically an oral GitHub repository. Elders were living documentation, children were new users learning the codebase, and every successful innovation was a merged pull request that updated the collective knowledge base. When someone figured out that heating certain stones before napping them made them easier to work, that information spread through social networks faster than a viral TikTok, because unlike dance trends, this actually affected survival rates. The seasonal planning alone would crash most modern project management software. You're tracking multiple parallel timelines. When will the salmon run? When will the berries ripen? When will the herds migrate? When will the weather turn? And you're not just tracking these, you're preparing for them months in advance, creating tools, preserving food, establishing camps, all while dealing with the daily chaos of survival. Now let's dive into something that'll really bake your noodle: navigation. You're standing in a forest that looks exactly the same in every direction. No GPS, no compass, not even a sundial. But somehow you need to find your way back to camp after tracking an injured deer for 3 days through terrain that would make a Navy SEAL cry. Your ancestors weren't just walking around hoping for the best, they were running sophisticated positioning algorithms that integrated multiple data streams. The sun's arc tells you direction, but also time of day and season. The moss on trees gives you a general north orientation, but you also know it varies based on local humidity, and prevailing winds. The stars at night aren't just pretty lights. They're a coordinate system that you've memorized so thoroughly you can navigate by the few visible through the forest canopy. You're tracking your position through dead reckoning, constantly updating your mental map with every step, every turn, every landmark. But here's the crazy part. You're not just navigating in space, you're navigating in time, that stream you're following. In spring it'll be twice as wide. That game trail? It only exists during migration season, that seemingly safe valley. In 2 months it'll be flooded. Your mental map isn't static, it's a dynamic four-dimensional model that changes with seasons, weather, and animal behavior patterns. You're basically running Google Earth in your head, except it includes temporal data, threat assessments, and resource availability overlays. And you're doing this while exhausted, hungry, and possibly injured. Because let's face it, twisted ankles didn't take sick days in the Stone Age. Tell me in the comments if you've ever gotten lost even with GPS, because your ancestors would be simultaneously impressed by our technology and appalled by our complete dependence on it. The communication protocols your ancestors developed were absolutely insane. We're not just talking about language here, we're talking about a full-spectrum communication system that utilized every available channel. Visual signals using body positioning and gestures that could convey complex messages across distances where sound would alert prey or predators. Acoustic signatures like specific bird calls that meant different things, even leaving physical markers in the environment, arranged stones, bent branches, scratches on trees, that could communicate messages to other tribe members who might pass by days later. This is basically blockchain technology, leaving an immutable record in the physical environment that could be read by anyone with the right decryption key, which in this case was cultural knowledge. They were even using chemical communication. Yeah, you heard that right. Your ancestors could smell fear, arousal, sickness, and aggression on each other. Their olfactory processing was so sophisticated, they could probably tell what you had for breakfast, whether you were lying, and if you were coming down with something, all from a quick sniff. Modern perfume and deodorant have basically destroyed this communication channel, but back then it was part of the data stream your brain was constantly processing. The resource management algorithms running in their heads would put modern supply chain software to shame. You're tracking the consumption rate of your food stores, the deterioration rate of different preservation methods, the energy expenditure of various activities, the caloric value of available foods, the time investment versus reward ratio of different foraging strategies, and the social dynamics of food sharing that could mean the difference between group cohesion and violent conflict. Every meal was a calculation. Eat too much now, and you might starve later. Save too much and it might spoil or get stolen. Share too generously, and you're seen as weak. Share too little, and you're excluded from the group's reciprocal altruism network. Your brain is running game theory calculations that wouldn't be formally described by mathematicians for another 30,000 years. Let's talk about something modern programmers know all too well: debugging. Except when your code fails in prehistory, you don't get a helpful error message. You get dead. Your ancestors were constantly debugging their survival strategies, and the error checking was brutal but effective. That new route to the water source that seems faster. Better test it carefully because the error message might come in the form of quicksand or a territorial predator. They developed testing protocols that we now call superstitions, but many of them were actually valid pattern recognition. If everyone who ate from that particular tree got sick, you don't need to understand bacteria to debug that problem. You just mark that tree as cursed and move on. The ritual behaviors that anthropologists love to study, most of them were just good programming practice. Always approach the water from the same direction. That's because you've tested that approach and confirmed it's safe. Always throw the first fish back. Maybe because someone noticed that keeping every fish led to population collapse and starvation the next season. These weren't primitive beliefs. They were debugged and tested protocols for survival. encoded in culture because they couldn't write them down. The biological firmware updates happening in their bodies were incredible too. Live at high altitude for a generation. Your descendants are running upgraded oxygen processing software. Survive multiple famines. Your metabolism gets patched to store fat more efficiently. Your body was literally rewriting its own code based on environmental feedback, and these updates were getting passed down genetically. We call it evolution, but really it's just biological machine learning with a really harsh training algorithm called natural selection. And the pattern matching abilities, oh man. The pattern matching, your ancestors could look at a broken twig and tell you not just that an animal passed by, but what kind, how big, how fast it was moving, how long ago, and whether it was worth tracking. They could see patterns in weather that predicted storms days in advance. They could read the health of an entire ecosystem from subtle changes in plant growth or insect behavior. This wasn't magic or mystical connection to nature. This was pure processing power directed at pattern recognition, because missing a pattern meant missing a meal or becoming one. The crazy thing is, they were doing this with hardware that's basically identical to yours. Same brain, same processing power, just different software. The cognitive load they carried daily would break most modern humans. We've outsourced so much of our computation to external devices that we've forgotten what our brains are actually capable of. Your ancestor could probably outperform a modern computer at certain tasks simply because they had to. There was no alternative, no backup, no tech support. Just raw biological computation running at maximum capacity every single day. They even developed error correction for information transfer. That's what all those repetitive songs and stories were about. Rhythm, rhyme, and repetition aren't just artistic choices, they're error correction codes. If someone messes up a line in a story, the rhythm breaks and everyone notices. It's like a checksum for oral data transmission. The stories had built-in redundancy too. Multiple versions of the same important information encoded in different narratives, so even if one got corrupted, the crucial data survived. This is literally how we design resilient computer systems today, except they figured it out without any formal mathematics. The social computation was perhaps the most complex of all. Your tribe is essentially a neural network where each person is a node processing information and passing it along. But unlike artificial neural networks, each node has its own agenda, biases, and processing quirks. You need to account for who exaggerates, who's reliable, who has good memory, who's observant, who's prone to panic. You're constantly weighing the credibility of information sources and adjusting your confidence levels accordingly. This is exactly what modern AI tries to do with information verification, except your ancestors were doing it in real time with life or death consequences. When someone says they saw signs of a big predator nearby, you're running a complex credibility assessment. Is this person generally reliable? Do they have reason to lie? Are they prone to misidentification? What's their emotional state? Are there corroborating observations? Your brain is basically running a biological fact-checking algorithm that social media companies would kill for. And let's not forget the biological clock management. Without any actual clocks, your ancestors maintained incredibly precise timing for countless activities. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to migrate, when animals would be at specific locations, when tides would be favorable, when seasonal rains would come. Their circadian rhythms were so finely tuned they could probably tell you the time within a half hour just from the quality of light and their internal sensations. Try that after a week without looking at any clocks and see how well you do. The manufacturing processes they developed were basically industrial engineering without the industry. Making a decent stone tool required understanding materials science, even if they couldn't articulate it. Different stones have different fracture properties. Temperature affects how they break. The angle of impact, the force applied, the tool used to strike, All of these variables had to be controlled precisely. One wrong hit and hours of work become worthless rubble. They were running quality control, process optimization, and iterative design improvement, all without writing anything down. Each generation refined the techniques, debugged the problems, and passed on improved versions. The medical diagnostics and treatment protocols were surprisingly sophisticated too. Without understanding germ theory or anatomy, they developed effective treatments through pure empirical testing. That plant that reduces fever. Someone noticed the correlation and remembered it. That wound treatment, using specific tree bark, trial and error revealed it prevented infection, even if they didn't know what infection actually was. They were running clinical trials without controls, blinds or statistical analysis, just raw pattern recognition and memory. The scariest part is their threat modeling. Modern cybersecurity experts think they're hot stuff, but your ancestors were running threat assessments that make penetration testing look like child's play. Every decision involved calculating multiple threat vectors. That nice berry patch might have food, but it's also where predators wait. That cave offers shelter but might already be occupied. That stranger might be friendly, or might be scouting for a raid. They had to model not just current threats but potential future ones. If we camp here tonight, what happens if it rains? If we take this route, what's our escape plan if we're ambushed? If we accept these strangers into our group, what's the long-term impact on group dynamics and resources? The agricultural revolution, when it finally came, was basically humanity's first major software upgrade. Suddenly, the algorithms that worked for hunting and gathering needed massive refactoring. The skills that kept you alive for millions of years became less relevant almost overnight in evolutionary terms. But here's the thing, all that computational power didn't disappear, it just got redirected. Instead of tracking herds, we started tracking inventories. Instead of reading weather for hunting, we read it for farming. Instead of memorizing migration patterns, we memorized trade routes. The hardware stayed the same, we just installed new software. And that's why you, sitting there in your climate-controlled room, still have all this processing power. Your brain is still capable of everything your ancestors could do. You've just never needed to run those programs at full capacity. But sometimes in moments of crisis or extreme focus, you might catch a glimpse of what your biological computer can really do. That time you somehow knew someone was watching you. That split-second decision that saved you from an accident. That moment when everything clicked and you solved a complex problem instantly. Here's where things get really weird. Dreams. Your prehistoric ancestors didn't have Netflix to process the day's events, but they had something arguably more powerful, an automatic defragmentation and simulation system that ran every night. While they slept, their brains were running scenarios, testing strategies, consolidating memories, and sometimes even solving problems that stumped them while awake. That recurring dream about being chased, that's your training simulator running threat response protocols. Even today, your brain uses dreams to practice dangerous situations without the actual danger. Your ancestors' dreams were essentially virtual reality training programs, except instead of learning to fly a plane, they were learning which shadows might hide death and which sounds meant run immediately, do not investigate, just run. The shamans and spiritual leaders, they were basically system administrators who learned to access and interpret these background processes. When they talked about vision quests and spirit journeys, they were describing directed debugging sessions where they'd intentionally stress test their neural networks to solve complex problems. That weird mushroom-induced trip wasn't just recreational, it was overclocking the pattern recognition systems to find connections that normal processing might miss. Don't try this at home though, seriously. Your ancestors had generations of tested protocols for this stuff, and even they sometimes got it catastrophically wrong. Let me blow your mind with something else. Art. Those cave paintings everyone goes crazy about. They weren't just doodles, they were external memory storage, graphical user interfaces for complex information systems. A handprint on a wall might mark who was responsible for maintaining that area. Animal drawings could encode migration timing, behavior patterns, weak points for hunting. The way they used perspective and shading shows understanding of three-dimensional representation that wouldn't be formally mathematized until the Renaissance. They were creating augmented reality before electricity existed, overlaying crucial information onto their physical environment. The musical instruments they developed weren't just for entertainment either. Rhythm is one of the most fundamental timing mechanisms in computation. Drums could synchronize group activities, encode messages, and even alter consciousness through specific frequencies. They discovered that certain rhythms could induce trance states that enhanced memory formation or creative problem solving. Modern binaural beats and brainwave entrainment. Your ancestors were doing that with turtle shells and hollow logs 30,000 years ago. They were literally hacking their own neural oscillations to improve performance. The apprenticeship systems they developed were essentially progressive skill trees that you see in video games today. You don't start by trying to make a perfect arrowhead. You start by learning to identify good stone, then you learn basic knapping, then crude tools, then refined tools. Each level unlocked new capabilities and responsibilities. The masters weren't just teaching skills, they were installing entire software packages, complete with muscle memory, pattern recognition templates, and decision trees. A master tracker wasn't just someone who could follow footprints. They had a complete mental database of gait patterns, weight distributions, behavioral tendencies, seasonal variations, terrain interactions, and probabilistic models for predicting future movement. When they taught apprentices, they weren't just showing them what to look for, they were transferring compiled libraries of pattern-matching algorithms that took decades to develop. Comment below if you've ever had a mentor who completely changed how you see your field, because that's what these knowledge transfers were like, except the field was not dying. The pregnancy and child-rearing algorithms were incredibly complex too. Without modern medicine, your ancestors had to optimize every aspect of reproduction and child development. When to have children based on seasonal food availability, how to maintain proper nutrition during pregnancy with limited resources, how to identify developmental problems early, how to socialize children while also teaching them that adorable curiosity could be deadly. The grandmothers in these societies were walking Wikipedia servers. Post-menopausal women, no longer able to have children themselves, became specialized information storage and processing units. They remembered which plants helped with which pregnancy symptoms, what signs indicated complications, how to increase milk production, how to treat childhood illnesses. This grandmother hypothesis isn't just about helping with childcare, it's about having dedicated biological computers that could store and process decades of medical and social data. The emotional processing capabilities were off the charts too. Without therapists or self-help books, your ancestors had to manage complex emotional states while maintaining group cohesion. They developed rituals and practices that we now recognize as sophisticated psychological interventions. Grief rituals that allowed for emotional processing while maintaining functionality, coming-of-age ceremonies that managed the psychological transition from childhood to adulthood, conflict resolution protocols that prevented minor disputes from destroying essential survival groups. They were running emotional regulation software that modern therapy is just rediscovering. The chemical knowledge was mind-blowing for people who didn't know what a molecule was. They knew which plants produced poisons, medicines, psychoactive compounds, preservatives, and dyes. They knew how to combine them, how to extract active ingredients, how to adjust dosages. This wasn't random experimentation. Well, not after the first few casualties anyway. This was systematic testing and documentation through oral tradition. They were running chemical simulations in their heads, predicting interactions and effects based on accumulated data. The weather prediction models in their heads were incredibly sophisticated. They could read cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, plant responses, and atmospheric pressure changes through physical sensations. A good weather reader could tell you not just if it would rain, but approximately when, how hard, and for how long. They were processing dozens of variables simultaneously, running probabilistic models that modern meteorology achieves with supercomputers and satellite data. Your ancestors did it with their eyes, nose, and that weird feeling in their joints before a storm. Let's talk about something really practical. Fire management. Fire wasn't just grab stick, make hot. It was a complex technology requiring deep understanding of materials, environmental conditions, and thermodynamics. Different woods burn at different temperatures and speeds. Wet wood needs specific techniques. Wind direction and speed affect everything. The size and shape of your fire structure determines heat distribution and duration. You're basically running computational fluid dynamics in your head, modeling airflow, heat transfer, and fuel consumption rates. And you need different fires for different purposes. A cooking fire needs consistent temperature. A signaling fire needs maximum smoke. A warmth fire needs long duration with minimal maintenance. A predator deterrent fire needs to last all night without constant feeding. Each type required different algorithms for construction and maintenance. Your ancestors could look at available materials and environmental conditions and instantly know which fire type was achievable and how to build it. The trade networks they established required incredible computational power. Without currency, they were running complex value calculations based on rarity, effort to obtain, usefulness, durability, and social factors. A good flint knapper might trade tools for food, but the exchange rate varied based on season, local availability, relationship between traders, and future obligations. They were essentially running a barter economy with floating exchange rates, futures contracts, and social credit systems, all without writing anything down. Every transaction required calculating immediate value, future implications, and social consequences. The child development programs were surprisingly sophisticated. They knew that children learned differently at different ages, so they developed age-appropriate teaching methods. Young children learned through play and imitation, older children through structured practice, adolescents through increasing responsibility and mentorship. They were implementing educational psychology principles that wouldn't be formally studied for millennia. They understood that learning required both success and failure, so they created controlled environments where children could fail safely while building competence. A child learning to track might start with obvious prints in mud, graduate to subtle signs in harder terrain, always with an experienced tracker nearby to prevent fatal errors. This scaffolded learning approach is exactly what modern education tries to achieve, except they did it without any formal pedagogy. The linguistic computation happening was insane. They were creating and modifying language in real time, developing new words for new concepts, borrowing from other groups, creating specialized vocabularies for different domains. A hunter's vocabulary for snow conditions might have dozens of terms that conveyed specific information about temperature, age, density, and safety. This isn't just having lots of words, it's having a precise technical language that encoded critical survival information. Modern programming languages wish they were this expressive and concise. The social lending and debt systems were basically distributed ledgers. Without writing, they maintained complex webs of obligations, favors, and debts across multiple individuals over extended time periods. You gave me meat when I was injured last winter, so I owe you assistance during this hunt. But you also owe my brother for helping build your shelter, and he owes my wife for medicine when his child was sick. These interconnected obligations created resilient social networks that functioned as insurance systems, investment mechanisms, and social bonds. Everyone was simultaneously tracking dozens of these relationships, calculating interest in terms of social capital, and managing their portfolio of social investments. The infrastructure planning was remarkable, considering they were nomadic or semi-nomadic. Seasonal camps weren't random. They were strategically located based on resource availability, defensive positions, water access, weather patterns, and travel routes. Setting up camp required calculating drainage patterns to avoid flooding, wind exposure for comfort versus smoke dispersal, sight lines for security, proximity to resources versus predator territories, and escape routes if things went bad. They were essentially running urban planning simulations for temporary settlements, optimizing dozens of variables with each placement decision. The biological hacking they achieved through diet and lifestyle was phenomenal. They figured out that certain foods improved night vision, others enhanced endurance, some aided healing. They developed breathing techniques that increased oxygen efficiency at altitude. They knew that specific exercises prepared the body for specific tasks. This wasn't just general fitness, it was targeted biological optimization. Modern biohackers with their supplements and devices are just rediscovering what your ancestors knew through careful observation and experimentation. The information warfare capabilities were surprisingly advanced. Now we need to talk about the most underestimated technology your ancestors developed: clothing. This wasn't just throwing a skin over your shoulders. Clothing was wearable technology that required understanding of thermal dynamics, moisture management, mechanical engineering, and materials science. A proper winter outfit in Ice Age Europe was a multi-layered system with each component serving specific functions. The inner layer needed to wick moisture while retaining heat. The middle layer provided insulation that worked even when compressed. The outer layer had to be windproof, somewhat waterproof, but still breathable. The engineering that went into a single properly made fur parka rivals modern technical outdoor gear. They had to calculate how different furs performed in different conditions. Rabbit fur is warm but delicate. Bear fur is durable but heavy. Seal skin is waterproof but doesn't breathe. You're mixing and matching materials like a materials scientist designing a composite. The placement of each type of fur, the direction of the hair, the treatment of the skin, every detail affected performance. And it all had to be assembled with sinew and bone needles, with seams that wouldn't leak heat or moisture, while maintaining flexibility for movement. Your ancestors were walking around in custom-engineered survival suits that they designed and built themselves. The food processing technologies were basically chemical engineering: fermentation, smoking, drying, salt curing. Each method required precise control of variables they couldn't directly measure. Too much salt and food becomes inedible. Too little and it spoils. Smoking requires specific temperatures and wood types to prevent spoilage without creating toxic compounds. Fermentation needs the right bacteria, temperature, and time, or you get poison instead of preservation. They were running controlled chemistry experiments, where failure meant starvation or death. They developed techniques for extracting nutrients from seemingly inedible sources: bone marrow, organ meats, even partially digested contents of herbivore stomachs during desperate times. They figured out that certain combinations of foods increased nutrient absorption, that cooking with specific stones added minerals to food, that sprouting seeds increased their nutritional value. This wasn't random, this was systematic nutritional optimization based on observed outcomes. The combat algorithms were terrifyingly efficient. Modern martial arts are basically attempting to recreate what your ancestors knew instinctively. Every calorie spent fighting was a calorie not available for survival, so combat had to be quick and decisive. They developed techniques that maximize damage while minimizing energy expenditure. Target the joints, the throat, the eyes. Use the environment as a weapon. Exploit psychological weaknesses. Create uncertainty. Strike when unexpected. These weren't honorable warriors following codes of conduct. These were practical survivors who understood that the best fight was the one that never happened, and the second best was the one that ended immediately. The group coordination during hunts was essentially distributed swarm intelligence. Without radios or detailed planning sessions, hunting parties coordinated complex maneuvers. Drivers would move prey toward ambush points. Ambushers would remain hidden until the optimal moment. Trackers would adapt to unexpected prey behavior. Everyone had to adjust their actions based on incomplete information while maintaining overall strategy. This is exactly what modern military units train for years to achieve, except your ancestors did it with hand signals and intuition developed through decades of practice. The botanical knowledge was encyclopedic. A skilled forager knew not just what was edible, but when each plant was at its nutritional peak, how to prepare it to remove toxins, which parts were medicinal versus nutritional, how to harvest without destroying future yields, and which plants indicated the presence of other resources. They were running ecological models that predicted plant availability based on rainfall, temperature, and seasonal variations. Finding a particular medicinal plant wasn't luck, it was systematic searching based on understanding of habitat preferences, associated species, and environmental indicators. The tool standardization and innovation cycles were fascinating. Once someone developed a particularly effective tool design, it would spread through trade networks, but each group would modify it based on local materials and needs. This is exactly how open source software development works. Someone creates a basic solution, others fork it, improve it, adapt it, and the best modifications get incorporated back into the main branch. Your ancestors were running collaborative development projects across thousands of miles without any formal communication infrastructure. The psychological profiling abilities were extraordinary. In a small group where everyone knows everyone, you had to be able to predict behavior with high accuracy. Who would crack under pressure? Who could be trusted with critical tasks? Who was likely to challenge leadership? Who would share food in a crisis? They developed intuitive psychological models that modern personality tests try to quantify. They could read micro-expressions, body language, vocal patterns, and behavioral histories to build accurate predictive models of individual behavior. This wasn't just useful for social harmony, it was essential for survival when choosing who to trust with your life. The time management systems were surprisingly sophisticated for people without clocks. They divided days into activity periods based on solar position, shadow length, and natural rhythms. They allocated effort based on energy availability, urgency, and resource optimization. A typical day might involve carefully scheduled foraging routes that coincided with animal activity patterns, plant moisture content, and optimal travel temperatures. They were running complex scheduling algorithms that balanced energy expenditure, resource gathering, social obligations, and safety considerations. Every decision involved temporal calculations. Start hunting too early, and you can't see tracks. Too late and prey has moved to shade. The mathematical concepts they utilized without formal mathematics were remarkable. They understood ratios when mixing medicines or creating tools. They used proportions when dividing resources or planning structures. They calculated probabilities when deciding whether to pursue wounded prey or cut losses. They optimized routes using principles that wouldn't be formally described until the development of graph theory. They were doing calculus when predicting projectile trajectories, statistics when assessing risks, and geometry when constructing shelters. The child safety protocols were incredibly sophisticated given the dangerous environment. Children had to learn about hazards without experiencing them fatally, so they developed elaborate teaching methods using stories, songs, and games that encoded danger information. That game where children pretend to be different animals, it's teaching them behavior patterns and threat recognition. Those scary stories about monsters in specific locations, they're keeping kids away from actual dangers. The seemingly arbitrary rules about not doing certain things, they're simplified heuristics for complex safety calculations children can't yet perform. The material culture preservation was like maintaining legacy code. Traditional techniques for making tools, preparing materials, or constructing shelters had to be preserved even as new methods developed. Why? Because you never knew when you'd need to fall back on older methods due to resource availability or environmental changes. That traditional way of making cordage that seems inefficient compared to the new method. It works with materials available in winter when the preferred plants are dormant. Maintaining this knowledge required deliberate effort to teach and practice techniques that might go unused for years. The ecosystem management was surprisingly sophisticated. Your ancestors understood that overexploiting resources led to long-term problems, so they developed sustainable practices through trial and error, rotation of foraging areas to allow regeneration, selective harvesting that preserved breeding populations, controlled burns to manage forest growth, and create favorable hunting grounds. They were implementing conservation strategies that modern ecologists are just rediscovering. This wasn't some mystical harmony with nature. It was practical resource management based on long-term observation of cause and effect. The mental health management, without therapists or medication, was remarkable. They developed rituals, social structures, and practices that maintained psychological well-being under extreme stress. Communal singing and dancing that released endorphins and synchronized group neurochemistry. Storytelling that provided meaning and context for suffering. Ritual grieving that allowed emotional processing while maintaining function. Social roles that gave everyone purpose and value. They were running distributed mental health support systems that prevented the kind of isolation and meaninglessness that plague modern society. The innovation adoption curves were exactly what we see in technology today. New techniques would be tried by early adopters, usually younger individuals with less to lose. If successful, they'd be copied by others. If they failed, they served as warnings. The most successful innovations would spread through social networks, modified and improved along the way. But there was always tension between innovation and tradition, between the risk of trying something new and the safety of proven methods. They were constantly balancing exploration versus exploitation, just like modern machine learning algorithms. The quality control systems for critical items were rigorous. A poorly made winter garment meant death. A failed weapon meant starvation. So they developed testing protocols, redundancy, and gradual deployment. New designs were tested in controlled conditions before being relied upon. Critical items had backups. Skills were practiced regularly to maintain proficiency. They were implementing quality assurance and disaster recovery procedures that modern businesses spend millions developing. The knowledge aggregation across groups was like distributed machine learning. Each group would develop local expertise based on their environment. When groups met for trade or seasonal gatherings, They'd exchange information, combining datasets to improve everyone's models. A coastal group's knowledge of tides and marine resources would combine with an inland group's understanding of terrestrial hunting. Mountain dwellers' altitude adaptation techniques would merge with valley residents' agricultural knowledge. This cross-pollination of ideas accelerated innovation and problem-solving beyond what any single group could achieve. The conflict resolution mechanisms were sophisticated game theory in action. Direct confrontation was expensive in terms of calories and risk, so they developed elaborate systems to resolve disputes without violence. Ritualized competitions, proxy conflicts through champions, resource-sharing agreements, intermarriage alliances, gift economies that created mutual obligations. They were running complex diplomatic algorithms that minimized conflict while maintaining group autonomy. These weren't peace-loving hippies. They were practical calculators who understood that cooperation usually had better returns than competition, but maintained the capacity for violence when necessary. The sensory enhancement techniques they developed were basically biological overclocking. They learned that certain practices could temporarily enhance specific senses. Fasting might sharpen mental clarity. Specific breathing patterns could enhance night vision. Certain postures improved hearing acuity. They were manipulating their own neurochemistry and blood flow to optimize performance for specific tasks. Modern athletes and performers are just rediscovering these techniques with fancy names like flow states and peak performance. Let's get to the final mind-bending reality. Your ancestors didn't just program for survival, they programmed for meaning. They developed complex mythologies, spiritual systems, and worldviews that weren't just primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated frameworks for understanding and navigating reality. These belief systems were essentially operating systems for consciousness, providing structure for processing the overwhelming complexity of existence. When they told stories about gods and spirits, they were creating mental models for forces they couldn't directly observe, but could infer from effects. The thunder god wasn't just a fantasy, it was a personification of atmospheric electrical phenomena that helped predict and respond to storms. The forest spirits weren't hallucinations, they were conceptual frameworks for understanding the complex interdependencies of ecological systems. These narratives encoded practical information in memorable formats, while also providing psychological comfort in an uncertain world. The initiation rituals were basically installing adult software packages, that traumatic coming-of-age ceremony that seems barbaric. It was systematically rewiring neural pathways, creating distinct before and after states that marked the transition from child protocols to adult responsibilities. The pain, isolation, and challenges weren't cruelty. They were creating neurochemical conditions that enhanced learning and memory formation. Modern neuroscience shows that moderate stress during learning improves retention and recall. Your ancestors figured this out through trial and error and built it into their cultural practices. The ancestor worship that anthropologists love to study was actually a distributed backup system for critical knowledge. By maintaining narratives about deceased experts, they preserved their knowledge and decision-making patterns. When facing a novel problem, they could essentially query the ancestor database by asking what would great-grandfather the master tracker do in this situation. This wasn't superstition, it was pattern matching against historical data encoded in narrative form. The decision to start agriculture was possibly the biggest software rewrite in human history. For millions of years, the code was optimized for mobile hunting and gathering. Suddenly, within a few thousand years, everything changed. The algorithms for finding food were replaced with algorithms for producing it. The social structures designed for small mobile bands had to scale to support larger sedentary populations. The risk models that assumed movement as a response to resource depletion had to be recalculated for staying in one place. This wasn't evolution, it was revolution, and the bugs in the new code are still causing problems today. Think about it. Your body is still running hunter-gatherer hardware. Your stress response that dumps cortisol and adrenaline. That's for running from predators, not sitting in traffic. Your craving for sugar and fat. That's for rare high-energy foods, not supermarket abundance. Your social anxiety in large groups. That's because your brain can only maintain about 150 meaningful relationships, the typical size of a hunter-gatherer band. You're running Stone Age software on modern problems, and wondering why you're getting errors. The transition to agriculture also created the first real wealth inequality. When everyone's nomadic, you can only own what you can carry. But once you can store surplus, suddenly some people have more than others. The egalitarian algorithms that kept hunter-gatherer societies relatively equal couldn't handle the new parameters. The social computation had to be completely restructured, creating hierarchies, specialized roles, and formal leadership structures that didn't exist before. Comment below if you've ever felt like modern life doesn't quite fit, because that feeling is your hunter-gatherer operating system, recognizing that the current environment doesn't match its programming. The development of writing was like creating external RAM. Suddenly, you didn't have to store everything in biological memory. Information could exist outside of human brains, accessible to anyone with the decryption key of literacy. This was revolutionary, but also dangerous. Knowledge that was previously distributed across many minds, resilient through redundancy, could now be centralized and destroyed. Burn a library, and you could eliminate centuries of accumulated knowledge. Your ancestors' distributed storage system was actually more robust in some ways than our centralized one. But writing also allowed for complexity that pure oral tradition couldn't support. Laws, contracts, detailed technical specifications, mathematical proofs, all became possible. The bandwidth for information transfer increased exponentially. Instead of spending years teaching an apprentice, you could write down instructions they could study independently. The debugging process that might take generations of trial and error could be compressed into a single lifetime of systematic experimentation. The emergence of cities required completely new social algorithms. The intimate face-to-face interactions that regulated behavior in small groups don't scale to thousands of strangers, so they developed formal laws, enforcement mechanisms, and institutional structures. Money emerged as a universal protocol for value exchange, replacing the complex web of social obligations with fungible tokens. Professional specialization allowed individuals to optimize for specific skills rather than maintaining the broad competence required for hunter-gatherer survival. Cities became supercomputers, with each citizen as a specialized processor contributing to collective computation. The development of mathematics and formal logic was essentially creating a programming language for reality itself. Instead of relying on intuitive pattern matching, they could now describe patterns precisely and manipulate them symbolically. Geometry let them predict and control spatial relationships. Arithmetic enabled precise resource management. Algebra allowed solving for unknown variables. Each mathematical innovation was a new tool for the cognitive toolkit, expanding what kinds of problems could be solved. The scientific method was basically systematic debugging for understanding reality, hypothesis, experiment, observation, revision. This is exactly how programmers identify and fix bugs. Your ancestors had always done this informally, but formalizing the process accelerated knowledge accumulation. Instead of waiting for natural experiments, they could create controlled conditions. Instead of relying on memory, they could document results. Instead of individual discovery, they could build on collective knowledge. The Industrial Revolution was another massive software update. The algorithms optimized for agricultural life, suddenly had to adapt to factories, schedules, and machines. The seasonal rhythms that had governed life for 10,000 years were replaced with clock time. The multi-generational skill development was replaced with standardized training. The connection to production was abstracted through wages and markets. Your great-great-grandparents went through a cognitive disruption as significant as the agricultural revolution, compressed into just a few generations, and now we're in the middle of another rewrite with the digital revolution. The algorithms that worked for industrial society are breaking down. The stable careers, predictable life paths, and clear social structures are dissolving into fluid networks and constant change. We're trying to run hunter-gatherer hardware with agricultural cultural software in a digital environment. No wonder everyone feels overwhelmed. Your brain, evolved to track 30 people, is trying to process social media feeds from thousands. Your risk assessment system, calibrated for immediate physical threats, is trying to evaluate abstract financial instruments and career decisions with decades-long consequences. But here's the incredible thing. You still have all that prehistoric processing power. It's just been redirected, suppressed, or overwhelmed by modern complexity. When you get lost in a flow state while coding, gaming, or creating, you're accessing the same focused attention your ancestors used while tracking. When you instantly judge someone's trustworthiness from their face, you're running the same social assessment algorithms. When you feel that something's wrong, even though you can't explain why, that's your pattern recognition system, detecting anomalies your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. The skills your ancestors developed aren't obsolete. They're just dormant. That's why wilderness survival shows are so popular. Why people find gardening therapeutic. Why camping feels refreshing, despite being objectively less comfortable than home. You're giving your Stone Age software a chance to run its native programs. The modern world has outsourced so much computation to external systems that we've forgotten our own capabilities. GPS replaced navigation skills, calculators replaced mental math, social media replaced face-to-face relationship management. We've become dependent on technological prosthetics that enhance some capabilities while atrophying others. But those dormant programs are still there, waiting. People who go off-grid for extended periods report heightened senses, improved physical awareness, better sleep, and mental clarity. That's not just the absence of modern stress. It's your biological computer reallocating resources to programs that have been idle. Your pattern recognition improves when it's not overwhelmed by artificial stimuli. Your social processing becomes more nuanced when dealing with actual humans instead of digital avatars. Your time sense recalibrates to natural rhythms instead of arbitrary schedules. The future isn't about going backward though. It's about integration. Understanding that you're running ancient software on modern problems helps explain why some things feel so difficult. Your procrastination isn't laziness. It's your energy conservation algorithm trying to prevent unnecessary calorie expenditure. Your social anxiety isn't weakness. It's your threat detection system overwhelmed by too many strangers. Your inability to focus isn't a disorder. It's your attention system adapted for scanning environment rather than sustained focus on abstract symbols. Once you understand this, you can work with your programming instead of against it. Create environments that trigger the right algorithms. Use natural light to regulate circadian rhythms. Engage in physical movement to activate problem solving. Limit social inputs to manageable numbers. Practice skills that reconnect you with your computational heritage. Learn to track, forage, or make things with your hands. Not because you need these skills for survival, but because exercising these programs improves your overall cognitive function. So what's the takeaway from all this? Your ancestors weren't primitive. They were running the same hardware you have, optimized for a different environment. The challenges they faced required computational power that we've largely forgotten we possess. Understanding this heritage isn't just historically interesting, it's practically useful for navigating modern life. You're not broken, you're not weak, you're not badly designed. You're a sophisticated biological computer running software optimized for a different operating environment. The mismatch between your programming and your environment causes friction, but it also reveals the incredible adaptability that let your ancestors survive everything from ice ages to agricultural revolutions to industrial transformation. You carry 30,000 years of successful debugging in your genes. Every one of your ancestors, without exception, solved the survival puzzle long enough to reproduce. You're the product of an unbroken chain of successful computation stretching back to the beginning of life itself. That anxiety you feel, that's your error detection system working. That creativity that emerges from boredom, that's your innovation algorithm engaging. That sudden insight that solves a problem, that's your pattern recognition system finding a match. You are, in every sense, a natural programmer. Your ancestors would be proud, and probably confused by your inability to start a fire without matches, but mostly proud. Thanks for joining me on this journey through humanity's computational history. Let me know in the comments what dormant programs you've noticed in yourself. What ancient algorithms still run in your daily life? And if you enjoyed this deep dive into your cognitive heritage, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Until next time, remember, you're not just using technology, you are technology. The most sophisticated biological computer ever developed. Act accordingly.